I was 38 when I decided to spend a week alone at an old hunting cabin in northern Maine. The year was 2006, early October, right after the leaves had started to turn and before the first heavy snow came down. I had rented the cabin through a man I met at a gas station 2 towns over, someone who knew someone who managed it. It wasn't listed anywhere, not online or in any book. Just an old wooden place out by a dirt road that stretched deep into the trees. That was the appeal. I wanted silence, to get away from my phone, from people, from all the usual noise of my job and the city. The drive took hours. The paved road ended sooner than I expected, and then it was nothing but cracked dirt and gravel, lined by thick spruce and pine, with branches clawing at the sides of my truck as I passed. Every now and then, I'd see broken fences half buried in weeds, or collapsed barns covered in moss. Signs of life, but from long ago. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dropping lower than I liked. The cabin itself was smaller than I imagined. The logs were dark with age, the roof dipped in the middle, and the porch sagged on one side. A rusty propane tank sat behind it. There was no sign of power lines, no wires anywhere. The nearest neighbor was probably 10 miles away. The air was cold and smelled like wet soil and pine needles. Inside, it was simple. One room with a wood stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, a small bed against the wall, and a shelf with a few pots and pans. There was an old oil lantern, some matches, and a pile of firewood stacked by the stove. The floor creaked with every step. No insulation, just logs, so every sound carried. The first night was calm. I got the stove going, cooked some canned beans, and laid on the bed listening to the wind press against the cabin walls. When it was fully dark, it was like being at the bottom of the ocean. No streetlights, no glow of towns, nothing. Just blackness pressing against the windows. The second day, I explored the area around the cabin. The land was thick with trees and brush. Behind the cabin was a slope leading down to a narrow stream. I followed the stream for a while until I came across an old trail, barely noticeable, cutting deeper into the woods. It looked unused for years. Curiosity pulled me forward, but after walking it for a few minutes, I had the uneasy feeling of being watched. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no movement. I turned back. That night, I struggled to sleep. I kept hearing noises outside. Not animal noises, at least not ones I could easily name. Branches snapping, like weight shifting through the woods. Once, I heard a dull thud, as if something heavy dropped not far from the porch. The cabin walls were thin, and every sound carried inside. I sat up, oil lantern lit, staring at the door. Eventually, silence returned, but I didn't rest well. By the third night, I was questioning if I had made a mistake coming here. I tried to write in a notebook to pass time, but my eyes kept drifting toward the window. The glass reflected the lantern light, and I couldn't see outside, but I felt like something could be standing just beyond, looking in. The unease grew heavier with each passing hour. On the 4th day, I walked further from the cabin, trying to distract myself. The air had dropped colder, and frost clung to the grass in shaded spots. About a mile east, I stumbled on something strange. An old campsite, though not recent. There was a fire ring made of stones, blackened by ash, but filled with dead leaves. Around it, there were beer cans rusted through. A broken folding chair collapsed into the dirt, and scraps of blue tarp half buried. First, I thought it was abandoned years ago, but then I noticed footprints in the softer ground nearby. Not fresh, but not that old either. Boot prints, big ones. They led off into the trees. That discovery kept me uneasy the rest of the day. If someone else was out here, it meant I wasn't alone like I thought. And if they were close, why hadn't I seen or heard them yet? That night, things got worse. I was lying in bed, lantern blown out, stove low, when I heard something outside again. This time it was clearer. Footsteps, slow, steady, circling the cabin. The floorboards under me vibrated as if someone pressed against the outer wall. My mouth went dry. I reached for the hatchet I had set near the stove, gripping it so hard my knuckles hurt. The steps would pause, then start again, crunching leaves, snapping twigs. After what felt like an hour, silence returned. I sat awake the rest of the night, heart pounding. By the morning, I decided I had to leave. I packed my bag quickly, tossing Ken's back into the truck, not caring about neatness. I went to start the engine, but the truck wouldn't turn over. Just a weak click. I tried again and again. Nothing. I popped the hood, hands shaking, and stared at the engine like I knew what I was doing. The battery cables were there, but the clamps looked loosened. Both of them. Someone had been under the hood. I felt sick. My stomach turned to stone as I realized it wasn't just my imagination. Someone had been here maybe the night before while I was inside listening. They had tampered with my truck. That meant they didn't want me leaving. I slammed the hood shut and looked around. The woods were still, but I felt eyes on me from every shadow. I grabbed my pack and the hatchet and went back inside the cabin. I decided I'd wait until daylight was stronger, then head toward the main road on foot. It was miles, but better than staying. The day passed painfully slow. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I barely ate, just paced, waiting for the sun to lower. By late afternoon, I strapped my pack and stepped out. I didn't lock the cabin, no point. I started down the dirt road, trying to keep a steady pace. I hadn't gone more than half a mile when I saw it. In the mud, fresh tracks, boot prints bigger than mine, leading in the same direction I was headed. I stopped cold. The prints were pressed deep, as if whoever left them carried weight. And they weren't old. They looked recent. My throat tightened. Whoever it was, they were between me and the road. I backed up, heart racing, then turned into the trees, deciding to cut across instead of following the path. I moved as quietly as I could, but every snapped twig under my boots sounded like a gunshot. I walked until my legs burned, pushing through brush, moving downhill until I reached the stream again. By then, it was getting dark. I had to make a choice. Risk walking blind in the woods all night or hunker down. I found a thick cluster of trees, sat against one, and tried to keep still. I clutched the hatchet and listened. Hours passed. My body ached from the cold ground, but fear kept me awake. Then I heard it again. Movement, not far. Crunching steps, slow, deliberate. They came closer, stopping, then starting again. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed myself against the tree, barely daring to move. The steps circled just like they had at the cabin. Whoever it was, they knew I was there. They were drawing it out, letting me know they had the upper hand. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would give me away. The sound moved off eventually, fading into the distance, but I knew they weren't gone. When dawn broke, I forced myself up and pushed through the woods until I finally reached the main road. Hours later, my legs shook, and my clothes were soaked with sweat and dew. Not long after, a passing pickup slowed and gave me a ride back to town. I never went back for the truck, never tried to find that cabin again. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know they had been watching me from the start. They didn't want me leaving. If I hadn't left on foot when I did, I don't think I would have made it out at all. I never thought I would find myself walking near the old cabin again. It had been years since I passed that part of the woods, years since I tried to bury the memories of what used to be my life with Emily. We divorced in 2017, and I told myself I would never go back near the lake where we once spent summers. That cabin had been her family's place, built by her grandfather back in the late 60s, sitting on the edge of a clearing about 20 miles from town in northern Wisconsin. When the marriage ended, I tried to keep myself away from everything tied to her. I stopped fishing at that lake. I stopped hiking the trails that cut around the ridge near it, and I tried not to think about the nights we had spent inside that small wooden structure. But one September evening in 2022, I found myself driving out there again. I told myself it was just curiosity, maybe even closure, but part of me knew it was something darker, a need to face the heavy knot of unease I still carried. The sun was sliding low when I parked my truck at the old dirt turnout off Highway 41. The path down to the cabin was overgrown, grass and thorny weeds pushing through the dirt where once it had been walked on every weekend. My boots sank into soft patches of mud, and the air smelled like damp earth and fallen leaves. There was no sound except for the faint scrape of crickets and the distant ripple of the lake through the trees. The cabin appeared slowly through the brush, its roofline barely visible at first. The place looked older, more tired than I remembered. The wooden planks had darkened with rot. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and the old metal chimney had streaks of rust running down it. The windows were clouded, one cracked across the middle, and the door hung just a little crooked on its hinges. I stood there for a long time, staring, my chest tight. I remembered the first night Emily and I stayed there together, back in 2009, when we were just dating. We had built a fire outside, cooked sausages on sticks, and laughed at the mosquitoes that swarmed around us. Back then, the cabin had seemed warm, almost alive. Now, standing in front of it in the fading light, it felt like a shell, something emptied out and left to decay. I stepped onto the porch. The boards groaned under my weight. I pulled at the door, and to my surprise it opened without resistance. Inside, the smell hit me first. Damp wood, stale air, and something else, something like old animal bedding. The cabin was darker than I expected, even though the windows weren't fully boarded. Dust hung in the air, and the floor was scattered with dead leaves that must have blown in through cracks. I moved slowly, careful not to make too much noise. My eyes adjusted to the dimness, and I saw the furniture was still there, though worse for wear. The old couch with torn cushions sat against the far wall. The wooden table we once ate meals at leaned sideways, one leg cracked. The small kitchen corner was coated with dust, the sink rusted and stained. In the corner near the fireplace, a pile of ashes from long ago rested untouched, gray and powdery. Every step I took stirred up memories, but they weren't the happy kind. They were sharp, bitter. I remembered arguments, nights when silence filled the space heavier than any storm outside. I remembered packing my bags the morning after she told me she didn't love me anymore, and walking out the same door I had just entered. As I moved deeper in, I noticed signs that someone else had been there since. An empty beer can on the floor near the couch. A damp sleeping bag bunched up in the corner. The faint mark of boot tracks in the dust leading toward the back room. I felt my skin prickle. The cabin wasn't abandoned the way I had imagined. It had been used, maybe by hunters, maybe by drifters, but definitely by someone in the last year or two. I walked into the back room where the bed used to be. The mattress was still there, sagging, with stains spread across the fabric. The closet door hung open, and inside was a scatter of old clothes. Not ours, just random shirts and a pair of torn jeans. On the floor beside the bed was a small hunting knife, rusted but clearly used not long ago. The blade had a dull smear on it that looked darker than rust. A feeling pressed on me then, something heavy in my chest. I wasn't supposed to be there. The place wasn't mine, not anymore, and whoever had been using it might not like me poking around. The silence outside suddenly felt sharper, like it was waiting for something. I looked through the window of the back room and saw the tree lean about 30 yards out. Shadows had stretched longer now, and the woods looked like they were folding in closer. I stepped back into the main room, my boots crunching on bits of broken glass near the door. My heart was thumping harder than it should have for just being inside an old cabin. Then I noticed something else. fresh footprints near the doorway. They weren't mine. These were smaller, sharper prints, leading in from the outside, pressed deep into the dust. My mouth went dry. Whoever left them had come in after me, or maybe not long before I arrived. I froze and listened. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then faintly, from the woods outside, I heard it. A slow crack of a branch, heavy enough to be a person. My stomach knotted. I turned off the flashlight I had been using and stood still in the dark cabin, waiting. The silence returned, but the sense of being watched didn't leave. I didn't want to meet whoever was out there. My mind raced with possibilities: squatters, hunters, or someone hiding from the law. None of those seemed like good encounters. I backed toward the door, careful to keep my steps light. The floor creaked under me, loud in the silence. Outside, the air felt colder. The clearing around the cabin stretched out under the last scraps of daylight, the grass tall and unkempt. I scanned the treeline but saw nothing. Still, the unease stuck to me. I walked fast toward the path, branches snapping under my boots. Every few steps I glanced behind, certain I would see someone step out from the woods, but the clearing remained still. By the time I reached the truck, the sky was sliding into darkness. My hands shook as I unlocked the door and climbed in. I sat there for a moment, breathing hard, staring down the overgrown path I had just walked. The cabin was hidden from view now, tucked back in the trees, but I could feel it lingering in my mind like a weight. I started the engine and pulled out onto the road, gravel crunching under the tires. The farther I got, the more my heartbeat slowed, but the feeling never fully left. I knew someone had been in there, someone living or hiding in that place, and I had nearly walked right into them. That night, back at my house, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured those footprints, the knife, the sound of the branch snapping. The cabin wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a warning. Going back had shown me that some things are better left in the past, locked away, no matter how strong the pull of old wounds might be. In the end, I understood something I hadn't before. That cabin wasn't tied to Emily anymore. It wasn't tied to our marriage or our fights or even the good times. It was just a dangerous place now, taken over by whoever needed it, and I had no reason to ever return. The past had already been cut away. What waited there now was only risk, only shadows. So I made myself a promise as I lay awake in the dark. I would never set foot near that cabin again. I still remember the night I decided to take my dog out to the old cabin. It wasn't a well-thought-out plan, more of a rushed choice. I had been restless for weeks, and when I saw the weather forecast showing heavy rain coming through, I figured it would be a good chance to get away from the noise of town. The cabin sat out in the woods in northern Montana, about 20 miles from the closest small town. It wasn't really a cabin I owned, just an old structure my uncle had abandoned years ago. Nobody had touched it since the late 80s, and it always carried a dead, heavy smell when I walked in. I packed the basics into the truck that morning: some canned food, a small gas stove, a lantern, my sleeping bag, and of course my old dog Max. He was 12 now, gray around his face and slower than he used to be, but he still perked up whenever I grabbed his leash. He was the only company I really wanted. By the time we drove down the dirt road leading to the cabin, the sky had gone dark and the rain had already started. It wasn't a soft drizzle either. It was the kind of rain that came down in sheets, hitting the windshield so hard the wipers could barely keep up. The dirt road was soft and washed out in places, and I had to grip the wheel tight just to keep from sliding into the ditch. When I finally pulled up to the clearing, the cabin stood there like a shadow, its roof sagging in the middle and its windows streaked with years of dust and dirt. The moment I stepped out, I smelled the wet pine trees and the damp earth around me. Max jumped down from the truck, sniffing the air with his tail wagging, though his movements were slower than before. I unlocked the swollen wooden door and pushed my way inside. The air hit me at once, stale, damp, and carrying that strange, lifeless smell that I always noticed here. The walls were darkened from years of rain leaking in, and the floorboards creaked under my boots. I set my bag on the old table, lit the lantern, and started settling in. Max circled around, sniffing the corners before laying down by the door. I laid out my sleeping bag in the corner and tried not to notice the water dripping from one spot in the ceiling into a small rusty pan that had been left there decades ago. As night fell, the rain grew heavier. I could hear it hammering on the tin roof, mixing with the sound of the trees bending and groaning outside. The lantern's light flickered against the rotting walls, and shadows stretched in strange shapes across the room. I heated a small pot of soup on the gas stove, the sound of it bubbling softly filling the silence. I shared a few bites with Max, who ate slowly and then rested his head on his paws. By the time midnight rolled around, the wind had picked up, slamming branches against the side of the cabin. Every sound was sharp in the silence. The thud of wet wood against the wall, the rattling of loose boards, even the small scratching noises from somewhere above me, probably rodents in the roof. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my nerves. Still, I couldn't sleep. I kept lying there in the dark, staring at the roof beams and listening. At some point, I sat up and checked on Max. He was still lying by the door, but something felt off. His breathing was shallow, almost like he was struggling. I crawled over to him and touched his side. His fur was warm, but his chest rose and fell unevenly. I stayed there with my hand on him for a long while, trying to calm myself down, telling myself he was just tired. The storm raged on for hours, and sometime near dawn, I realized the silence in the room had changed. I sat up again, the lantern nearly burned out, the air heavy with the smell of wet wood. Max wasn't moving. I put my hand on him again, pressing harder this time, waiting for the rise of his chest. Nothing. His body felt still and heavy in a way it never had before. I knew right then he was gone. I stayed on the floor beside him for what felt like hours. The storm outside quieted down as the morning came, but inside the cabin everything felt heavier, colder. I didn't cry much. Tears came for a moment and then stopped, leaving me hollow. He had been with me for so many years, through breakups, job changes, empty nights, long walks. Now, in this dead old cabin, he was just gone. When the rain finally slowed, I knew I couldn't just leave him there on the floor. I pulled on my boots, grabbed the shovel I kept in the back of the truck, and went outside. The ground was soft from the rain, mud sticking to everything, but I found a spot near the edge of the clearing where the trees opened just enough to let light through. The work was slow, the shovel sinking deep into the wet earth, my arms heavy, but I kept going until the hole was deep enough. I carried him out wrapped in my old jacket. He felt heavier than ever, his body limp in my arms. I laid him down in the hole carefully and stood there for a long time, staring at the gray sky and the dark soil. I filled the dirt back in slowly, my boots sinking deeper into the mud with each step. By the time I was done, I was soaked and exhausted, leaning on the shovel like it was the only thing holding me up. I marked the spot with a pile of flat stones I gathered from the clearing, stacking them carefully so I would know it was him. I stood there until the rain started again, light at first and then heavier, running down my face. The cabin loomed behind me, lifeless and dark, but I couldn't bring myself to go back inside right away. When I finally stepped back into the cabin, it felt emptier than before. His spot by the door was bare now, and the silence pressed down hard. I packed my things slowly, not rushing, but knowing I couldn't stay there another night. The smell of damp wood, the broken furniture, the leaking roof, it all felt heavier now, like the cabin itself was nothing more than a shell. I loaded the truck, glanced back at the stones one last time, and started the engine. The road out was slippery, the rain pouring down again, but I kept my hands steady on the wheel. I drove away without looking back at the cabin, only keeping the image of that stone marker in my head. By the time I reached town, the storm had started to pass, leaving everything washed out and gray. I pulled over in a gas station parking lot and sat there for a while, staring at the rain running off the roof. The passenger seat next to me was empty, and that emptiness sank in harder than anything else. I knew I wouldn't go back to that cabin again. It was just a rotting old place with a heavy smell and broken walls, but now it carried something more. It was where my dog's last breath had left him, and where I had left a piece of myself behind with him. The cabin would stand there until it finally fell in on itself, and I would keep driving past those woods, knowing it was still there, holding the memory of that night. It was in the fall of 2007, and I was 31 years old when I decided to try something I had been planning for months, building a small cabin in the middle of the woods near a creek that ran along the edge of my family's old property in northern Arkansas. The place was about 2 hours from the nearest town, and the drive was nothing but narrow roads, gravel stretches, and hills that seemed to close in on you the farther you went. I had been out there plenty of times before for hunting and fishing, but I had never stayed long. This time, I wanted to set up a small cabin that I could use whenever I wanted to get away from everything. The day I went out there, the weather was heavy. The air carried that smell that comes before rain, and the sky hung low and gray, the kind of gray that makes everything around you look darker than it really is. I parked my old truck in a clearing, close enough to unload my supplies, but far enough from the tree line that I wouldn't get stuck if the ground turned to mud. The truck bed was filled with tools: an axe, a saw, nails, a hammer, a coil of rope, and a tarp I figured I'd use to cover the roof until I could do something better. I also brought some food, a sleeping bag, and a small propane lantern, thinking I'd be fine for a night or two while I worked. By the time I hauled everything to the spot I had picked, the first drops of rain started to fall. It was light at first, tapping on the leaves, but I could hear the sound building in the distance, rolling closer like a slow wave. I didn't want to waste any time, so I started right away, cutting small trees and clearing the ground. Every swing of the axe seemed louder because of how quiet the woods were, except for the birds that scattered when I first arrived. The rain picked up, hitting the tarp I had spread across a fallen log to keep my gear somewhat dry. After a few hours, I had enough logs cut to start framing the cabin. I wasn't making anything fancy, just 4 walls big enough to sleep in and stay dry. The rain turned harder, and the dirt under my boots began to soften, clinging to the soles and slowing me down. My clothes were damp from sweat and rain, sticking to me in a way that made me feel heavier with each movement. I kept telling myself it was worth it, that once I got a roof up, I'd be able to get out of the weather. By late evening, I had 3 walls halfway up, the logs stacked notched and uneven but standing. I covered the top with the tarp, weighing it down with branches and rocks, just to give myself a dry space for the night. The storm had grown stronger. Thunder shook the air, and the rain was pounding so loud on the tarp that I could barely hear the creek anymore, though I knew it was there, swelling and rushing with the runoff. I lit the propane lantern and set it inside the half-finished cabin. The weak yellow glow spread across the wet logs, making the shadows sharp and jagged. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the driest patch of dirt I could find, though it was still damp and smelled like wet soil. My back ached, my hands were raw, and I could feel the sting of blisters forming under the skin. I forced myself to eat a little jerky and drink water, though my stomach was tight with the kind of unease I couldn't shake. It wasn't just the storm, it was the silence underneath it, Every time the thunder faded and the rain eased for a moment, I realized how alone I was out there. No voices, no engines, no lights, just black woods stretching for miles. At one point, I heard something move through the brush near the creek. A crack of branches, slow steps in the wet ground. My first thought was deer, maybe even a black bear, but whatever it was, it stopped not long after it started, as if it had noticed me and was waiting. I sat there with my back against the logs, listening, the lantern light flickering as the wind pushed against the tarp. Hours dragged by. The rain never let up, and the ground inside the cabin grew muddier as water seeped in around the logs. I tried to sleep, but every sound outside made me snap awake. I kept the axe close, its handle slick from my damp hands. My chest felt tight, and my ears strained for anything beyond the storm. At one point, I could swear I heard breathing, slow and heavy, but it could have been the way the wind moved through the trees. By the middle of the night, the creek had grown so loud it sounded like it was right beside the cabin. The water had risen, and I started to worry it might flood into the clearing. I shined the lantern outside for a second, and the sight made my stomach drop. The whole lower area near the bank was covered, water rushing through it so fast it pulled branches and debris along with it. If it kept rising, my cabin would be in trouble. I stayed awake, staring at the tarp flapping above me, hearing every drop, every branch that snapped in the woods. My eyes burned from staying open too long, but I couldn't relax enough to close them. I thought about how far my truck was parked, how bad the trail would be in the mud, and whether I could even get it out if I had to leave. When dawn finally came, the rain had eased into a steady drizzle, and the gray light revealed the damage. The ground around my half-built cabin was a mess, water cutting small streams through it, the creek wider and meaner than I had ever seen it. The cabin itself looked rough, one side leaning from the softening mud. My supplies were soaked, even though I had tried to keep them dry. I stood there in the wet clearing, looking at what I had built and how useless it already seemed. The woods around me smelled like rot and wet bark, and the air was cold enough to sting my skin. My arms felt weak, my head heavy from no real rest. I knew then that staying any longer was asking for trouble. If the rain came back, the creek could cut me off completely. If something bigger than a deer had been watching me in the night, I had no way to know. What I did know was that I wasn't ready for it. Not the storm, not the isolation, not the weight of being out there with nothing but thin walls and a tarp. I packed what I could, slung the axe across my back, and made the slow, careful walk back to my truck through mud that tried to pull my boots off with every step. The truck barely made it out, the tires spinning more than once, but I pushed it until the gravel road finally appeared through the trees. When I looked back one last time at the path leading down to the creek, I saw nothing but rain hanging in the air and the tops of the trees swaying. The cabin was still down there, half standing, half sinking into the mud. I didn't go back for it. I knew it was lost. That night, when I finally got home, I sat in my chair and let the silence of my own house wrap around me. I realized how different silence feels when you know you're not cut off, when you know you can open a door and see lights outside. Out in those woods, in that rain, silence wasn't peace. It was pressure. It was the weight of being alone with nothing but what you could carry. The cabin never got finished. It's probably gone now, washed away by the creek or buried in the mud. But I remember every sound, every drip of rain on that tarp, every crack in the brush. I learned that night that wanting to be alone and truly being alone are two very different things. And I learned the hard way that some places, no matter how much you think you can handle them, don't give you the chance to make mistakes twice. I was 34 when I decided to take a break from the city and spend some time alone in the mountains of Montana. It was the fall of 1998, the last week of October, when the air was already sharp with cold and the trees had turned into dark skeletons along the hillsides. A friend of a friend had told me about a small hunting cabin that could be rented cheap. It was far from any town, just off an old dirt road that wound through the pines for what felt like forever. I figured the silence, the space, and the distance from people would help me reset my mind. The cabin sat in a clearing with nothing around but thick forest. It was small, made of dark, weathered wood, with a tin roof that looked like it had been patched a dozen times. The windows were narrow, and the front porch sagged slightly on one side. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and old smoke. There was a wood stove against the far wall, a rough wooden table, a single bed with a thin mattress, and not much else. The place felt cold and empty, but I liked that. I told myself it was exactly what I needed. The first day was simple. I unloaded my few supplies, some cans of food, a flashlight, extra batteries, an old camping lantern, a couple of wool blankets, and a thermos. I split a little firewood from the pile stacked near the cabin, got the stove going, and spent the evening reading under the dim glow of the lantern. Outside, the wind pushed through the trees with a low whistle. When I finally turned in for the night, the silence was so heavy it pressed down on me. The second day, I walked the trails nearby. The forest felt endless, with moss hanging off fallen logs and animal tracks pressed into the damp ground. I didn't see another person all day, not even a car on the road below the ridge. That night, after cooking beans on the stove, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my shoulders. The stars were bright but cold, and the clearing around the cabin felt strangely exposed. I had the sudden thought that anyone, if they wanted, could stand in the woods and watch me. The shadows at the tree line seemed too still. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks. By the third night, the weather shifted. Clouds rolled in heavy and low, and the temperature dropped. I spent the day indoors, writing in a notebook and listening to the wood crack in the stove. When darkness fell, the wind picked up. It rattled the cabin walls, and the tin roof clattered now and then. I tried to ignore it, but when I stepped outside to get more wood, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. In the mud near the porch steps were footprints. They weren't mine. I hadn't been in that part of the yard since unloading my supplies. The prints were fresh, pressed deep, as if someone heavy had stood there recently. The size looked bigger than my boots. They led from the edge of the clearing straight to the porch, then turned back the same way toward the trees. I stood there for a long time, holding the lantern in one hand, trying to listen over the wind. The woods were dark, nothing but shapes stacked on shapes. I told myself maybe a hunter had wandered close during the day. Maybe he checked out the cabin and left. Still, the thought of someone walking right up to where I slept didn't sit right. I carried the wood inside and shoved the door shut harder than I needed to. Sleep was hard to come by. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard movement outside. I got up twice in the night to stoke the fire and check the windows, but nothing was there. The fourth day, I couldn't shake the unease. I walked the clearing looking for more prints. The ground was damp from the cold rain, but I didn't see any new tracks. I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see someone standing between the trunks. The silence felt different now. Instead of peaceful, it was heavy and watching. That evening, as the last light drained from the sky, I locked the door and checked it twice. I put my knife on the table beside me, though I knew it was hardly enough if someone wanted to force their way in. I tried to read again, but my eyes kept flicking toward the windows. The lantern light barely pushed back the dark, and every reflection made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I woke to a sound. It wasn't the wind this time. It was sharper, closer. It came again. A crunch, like weight pressing into leaves outside the cabin wall. I held my breath, listening. The noise moved slowly, circling. I sat up, straining to hear. The steps paused, then scraped against the porch. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might drown the sound out. I pictured those muddy footprints again. I reached for the lantern and held it up, but I didn't dare open the door. The footsteps faded after a while, drifting back into the woods. I stayed awake until the stove burned down to embers. When daylight came, I stepped outside. The ground was disturbed again. New footprints circled the cabin, leading up to the porch just like I'd heard. My stomach dropped when I noticed one set of prints pressed against the dirt directly under the small window by the bed. Whoever it was had stood there, looking in. I couldn't convince myself to stay calm anymore. I packed my things fast, stuffing them into my bag without much care. My plan was to hike back down the dirt road to where it met the highway, then try to flag someone or walk until I reached the small town I'd passed on the way in. I had about 2 miles of forest road before I'd be in sight of anything. The woods felt different as I left, like they were holding something inside them. Every step, I kept turning around, half expecting to see someone following. The dirt was wet from the night's rain, and I noticed new tracks now and then, boot prints, big ones, headed the same way I was going. I walked faster, clutching my bag tight, until finally the road opened up near the highway. Relief hit me so strong I almost laughed. But when I stopped at the edge of the trees, catching my breath, I noticed something that froze me. Across the highway, where the forest started again, was a line of fresh prints leading in. They weren't mine. Whoever had circled that cabin was still ahead, moving deeper into the woods in the direction of town. I stood there a long time, staring at those prints, realizing how close I'd been without knowing it. I didn't go back for the cabin. I didn't even look behind me again. I walked the shoulder of the highway until I reached the first gas station. Hours later, my legs aching and my throat dry. The cabin was supposed to give me quiet. Instead, it left me with something worse than noise. Even now, I still see the shape of those prints pressed into the mud, leading back into the trees, like someone had been waiting out there all along. I had rented out the old cabin at the edge of the countryside because I needed space, far away from the noise of the city. The cabin stood in a clearing, surrounded by tall grass and fields that stretched for miles, with a narrow dirt road leading up to it. It was late September of 1998, the air cooler at night, the days shorter, and the evenings bringing that heavy silence you only find far away from towns. I was 31 at the time, and I thought a couple of weeks in solitude would clear my head. The cabin was old but still holding itself together. The wood outside had turned gray, the roof sagged a little in the middle, and the porch creaked every time I stepped on it. Inside, the floorboards were uneven, the smell of damp wood and dust thick in the air. The living room had a small fireplace with soot stains above it. In the corner sat a wooden rocking chair that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The bedroom was plain, just a bed frame with a thin mattress, a dresser, and a single lamp that flickered when I plugged it in. The nearest neighbor was about 3 miles away. The owner of the cabin, an older farmer named Reed, told me the area was quiet, just the occasional deer or stray dog wandering through. He gave me the keys, a warning about the poor wiring, and left me to it. The first night passed without much trouble. I lit the fireplace because the nights had started to bite, and the sound of the wood cracking filled the silence. The countryside at night is different. In the city, you always hear something. A car horn, a distant siren, people talking. Out here, it's pure silence, broken only by the wind or some animal moving through the brush. It's a silence that presses against you, making you notice every small creak of the cabin. By the third night, I had settled into a routine. I'd chop a little wood in the late afternoon, boil water on the small gas stove, eat whatever canned food I'd brought, and then sit by the fire until it got late. I thought I'd spend time reading, but most evenings I just stared at the flames and listened to the woods outside. It was on the fourth night when I first noticed something off. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, crunching steps moving along the gravel of the dirt road, then stopping. I stayed still, listening, thinking it was just an animal. But these weren't the quick movements of a deer or fox. These were heavier, deliberate. The steps stopped near the porch. My heart thumped hard in my chest as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting. After a long minute, the steps moved again, circling the cabin, slow and steady. The sound of grass being pushed down, twigs snapping, then silence. I didn't move the rest of the night. The next morning, I stepped outside, scanning the area. The grass around the side of the cabin was flattened, as if someone had walked there. I told myself it could have been a large animal. Maybe a cow from a nearby farm had wandered too close. But something about the tracks felt wrong. They weren't wide or uneven like a cow's, and they circled too close to the cabin. That day I felt uneasy, like I was being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the fields, but nothing moved except the wind and the grass. The fifth night was worse. I sat in the rocking chair by the fireplace until the fire burned down low. The cabin was dim, shadows pressed against the walls, and the silence outside felt heavy. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The crunch of gravel on the dirt road, slow and steady. The sound grew closer until it stopped just outside the cabin. I sat frozen in the chair, my ears straining. The porch creaked. Someone or something was standing there. I could almost hear the faint shift of weight on the boards. Then came a soft scrape against the wooden wall, like fingertips dragging across it. I grabbed the old axe I'd brought in for splitting wood and sat there, gripping the handle so tight my hands hurt. The scraping lasted a few seconds, then stopped. Silence followed. I didn't sleep at all that night, sitting with my back to the wall until daylight came through the small window. When I went outside, I saw long, thin scratches on the wood near the front door. They were too high for an animal and too deliberate. My stomach sank as I stared at them. I thought about packing up and leaving, but pride or maybe stubbornness held me there. I told myself it was probably kids, maybe locals who knew about the cabin and wanted to mess with anyone staying there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was wasn't just playing around. The sixth night, I kept the axe close by again. I didn't light the fire, hoping darkness would keep attention off me. The cabin was freezing, the air damp, but I sat still, listening. Around 2 in the morning, the sound came again, but different this time. It wasn't footsteps, it was the sound of breathing. Deep, slow breathing, just outside the thin wall of the bedroom. I lay in bed, holding my breath, every muscle stiff. The breathing moved like whoever it was had pressed their face against the wall and was sliding along it. Listening, I could hear the faint crunch of grass underfoot as they shifted. Then came a sudden thud, like a fist hitting the wall near the window. I jolted up, clutching the axe, my chest tight. The sound stopped. Silence returned. That morning, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I stuffed my things into my duffel bag and loaded them into the car. As I walked around to the driver's side, I saw something in the dirt road leading up to the cabin. Footprints, clear ones made by boots. They led right up to the porch, circled around the cabin, and then disappeared back down the road toward the fields. They weren't kids. They weren't animals. Someone had been coming to the cabin night after night, watching, waiting. I didn't stay to find out what they wanted. I drove straight down the dirt road, the cabin shrinking in my rearview mirror, the fields on both sides looking endless. I didn't look back again until I was miles away on the main road. Even now, years later, I think about that cabin sometimes. I think about how far away it was from everything, how alone I had been. Whoever was out there knew it too. The scratches on the wood, the breathing against the wall, the footsteps circling at night. They weren't accidents. They were deliberate. And the worst part is, I'll never know who it was or what they planned to do if I hadn't left when I did. I was 33 years old the year I got assigned to the ranger station out in the northern stretch of Wyoming. It was 1998, and I had been working for the Park Service for about 5 years, moving from smaller posts to bigger, more isolated ones. The cabin they put me in was nothing fancy, just a one-room log place with a tin roof, a small propane heater, and a radio set for emergencies. It sat about 20 miles off the nearest paved road, surrounded by thick pine and aspen, the kind of place that was meant to be quiet, where a ranger like me could watch over hunters, campers, and the occasional lost hiker. At first, I liked the silence. The long drives in had always been my favorite part of this work. Dust on the gravel road, open sky, mountains dark on the horizon. The cabin was old, built sometime in the 50s, and though it had been patched up through the years, you could tell it wasn't meant for comfort. The floorboards creaked in certain spots, and the windows rattled when the wind cut through the trees at night. The bed was just a cot with a thin mattress, but it was enough. My job was simple: patrol the trails during the day, check fire pits, make sure nobody was breaking rules, keep notes of wildlife sightings. I carried a sidearm, more for animals than people, and a worn-out notebook where I wrote everything down. Nights were usually uneventful. I'd heat up canned food, maybe read by lantern light, and try to sleep with the sound of owls and wind outside. But after about a week, little things started happening that didn't sit right with me. The first time I noticed, it was small. I came back from a patrol and found the cabin door open just a crack. I thought maybe I hadn't latched it properly. It was an old cabin, and the wood had shifted over the years, so the door didn't shut clean unless you pulled it hard. I told myself it was nothing. Then 2 days later, I found muddy footprints by the back wall. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I wore heavy ranger boots with deep treads, and these were smoother, like from worn sneakers or work boots. They led from the tree lean to the cabin wall and then disappeared into the dirt again. I walked the perimeter but found nothing else. I figured maybe a hunter had wandered too close, maybe curious about the station. Still, it bothered me. The woods were wide open in the day, but at night they closed in tight. When I sat in the cabin with the lantern burning, I started to notice how much I could hear. Twigs snapping, branches breaking, things moving. At first I thought it was deer, maybe elk. Then one night, I was writing in my notebook when I heard what sounded like a slow drag against the wall outside. Not footsteps, more like someone dragging a stick or even their hand along the logs. I froze and just listened. It went from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped. I waited for footsteps moving away, but there weren't any. The next morning, I checked the wall. Sure enough, there was a faint smear across the logs. Could have been dirt or grease. I knelt down to look closer and realized it was dark, almost black, like old oil. I didn't know what to make of it. I kept it in my notes but didn't radio it in. I didn't want to sound paranoid. A couple nights later, I woke up to the sound of gravel crunching outside. Not the usual rustle of animals, but steady, heavy steps. I reached for my flashlight and shined it out the window, but saw nothing except trees. The steps stopped the second I moved. I stayed up for the rest of the night with my sidearm out, my eyes on the door. Nothing else happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing just out of view, waiting. By the second week, I was sleeping less and listening more. I stopped cooking at night because the smell might carry. I ate cold food from cans and kept the lantern low. My ears tuned to every sound. Sometimes I thought I heard breathing outside the cabin, faint and controlled, like someone trying not to be heard. On the 15th night, things reached the point I couldn't ignore. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of the door handle moving. slow, deliberate, like someone testing it. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the door. The rattling stopped instantly. I shouted out, even though I knew nobody was supposed to be around, but there was no answer. I sat there for hours, sidearm in my lap, until the sky started to gray with dawn. When I went outside, I found fresh shoe prints in the dirt right in front of the door. Worn soles again, definitely not mine. They came from the trees, stopped at the door, then turned back. I followed them for a short while into the woods, but they broke apart in the underbrush. Whoever it was knew the area well enough to move without leaving much trace. That morning, I finally radioed in. I told the main office I suspected there were trespassers around the station. They said they'd send someone up at the end of the week, but until then, I had to hold my post. That meant 5 more nights in that cabin. Those were the longest 5 nights of my life. Every sound made my chest tighten. Sometimes I heard faint whistling in the trees, almost like someone calling, but never close enough to pinpoint. Once, I woke up to find one of my notebooks missing from the shelf where I kept it. I searched every corner of the cabin and finally found it outside on the ground near the tree line, pages bent and damp from dew. Someone had taken it and left it there. By the time Friday came, I was worn thin from lack of sleep. The forest no longer felt open and beautiful. It felt like a trap. Every shadow looked like a person. Every movement made my skin crawl. When the relief ranger finally arrived, I was standing outside the cabin with my gear already packed. He took one look at me and asked if I was sick. I didn't answer. I just pointed to the tracks by the door, still fresh from the night before. He crouched down, studied them, and nodded slowly. He didn't joke about it. He didn't tell me I was imagining things. He just said he'd take it from here. I left that cabin without looking back. On the drive down the gravel road, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees, watching the truck pull away. I never went back to that station. The official report called it unauthorized trespassing by unknown persons. Nothing else was ever logged. But I know what I heard, what I saw, and what I felt in those nights. Someone had been out there, circling that cabin, testing the door, leaving signs just enough to remind me I wasn't alone. Even now, years later, whenever I think about it, what unsettles me most isn't the noises or the footprints. It's knowing that whoever it was never wanted to break in or steal anything. They just wanted me to know they were there, and they succeeded. I had been living in Birmingham most of my life, but that autumn of 2013 I decided I needed a break from the city noise. I had just turned 32, work was eating up most of my weeks, and I felt like my head was always heavy with the pressure of deadlines. A friend of mine had once mentioned an old cabin he used to stay in when hiking through parts of Shropshire. It wasn't anything fancy, just an isolated wooden place tucked against the edge of a forest, with fields stretching out on one side and thick woods on the other. It sounded perfect to me. I drove there on a Thursday afternoon in late October, the kind of day where the sky stays gray from the moment you wake up until it's dark. The drive took just under 2 hours. By the time I pulled onto the dirt path that led up to the cabin, the air had that damp, cold bite that seeps into your jacket and makes you move quicker. The trees that lined the path had lost most of their leaves, so the ground was coated in soggy orange and brown patches. I parked my car near the cabin and killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy. The cabin itself was smaller than I imagined. Weathered wood walls, a roof that sagged slightly in the middle, and a single narrow chimney. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years, but I had been told the key was under a loose stone near the steps. Sure enough, I found it, and the door unlocked without much struggle. Inside, it smelled faintly of damp wood and dust. A single-room layout greeted me. Old wooden floorboards, a basic kitchen area against one wall, a fireplace with a stone hearth, and a narrow bed tucked into the corner. I unpacked slowly, set my bag down, and lit the small lantern I had brought. The air inside was cold, so I gathered some logs from the pile outside and got a fire going. By the time I finished, evening was creeping in. I sat on the wooden chair near the fire, the flames crackling, and let the quiet soak in. That kind of silence, away from traffic and voices, is comforting at first, but after a while it almost becomes loud in its own way. It must have been around 7 when I stepped outside for some air. The fields stretched out empty in front of me, and behind me the woods looked darker than I'd ever seen. The line of trees swayed slightly in the wind. As I stood there, I caught a glimpse of movement near the edge of the woods. It was faint, almost like a person standing there. My first thought was that it was my imagination, the way shadows twist when your eyes strain in low light. But the shape didn't vanish. It stood still as if watching. I felt my stomach tighten. I squinted, trying to make out details. It looked like a woman, thin, with long hair, but the light was so poor I couldn't be certain. She didn't move, not even when the wind pushed through the trees. I stood frozen for what felt like minutes. Finally, I forced myself back inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was probably a trick of the light or some local hiker wandering the woods, though the idea of someone else being out here unsettled me even more. The night dragged on slowly. I tried to read by lantern light, but my eyes kept drifting back to the small window that faced the woods. I couldn't see much in the dark, just faint outlines of the trees, but I kept feeling like something was there. Around midnight, I finally dozed off in the bed, though the sleep was light and broken. When I woke, it was still dark outside, maybe 3 in the morning. The fire had burned low, leaving only red embers. I sat up and immediately noticed something that made my blood go cold. The lantern, which I had left on the wooden table, was now sitting on the floor by the door. I hadn't moved it. I was sure of that. My body froze, and the silence of the cabin pressed down heavier than ever. I told myself maybe I had been half asleep and placed it there without thinking, though I didn't believe my own excuse. I got up, picked it back up, and set it on the table. Then I checked the lock on the door. It was still latched. I tried to push the unease aside and crawled back into bed, pulling the blanket over me even though I wasn't cold anymore. The next morning, the sky was pale and dull, and I was grateful for daylight. I stepped outside to clear my head. That's when I saw the footprints. They were faint but clear enough in the wet soil near the side of the cabin. Bare feet, small, pressed into the mud as if someone had walked right up to the wall during the night. The prints led from the tree line straight toward the cabin, then turned back. My chest tightened. Whoever it was hadn't been a trick of my eyes. I spent most of that day on edge, unable to relax. Every sound outside made me flinch. The woods felt hostile, like eyes were hidden in them. I tried to focus on chopping some of the wood pile smaller for the fire, keeping busy, but every time I turned around, I felt like someone was watching. That evening, when the sky went dark again, I couldn't bring myself to step outside. I locked the door early, pushed one of the chairs against it, and sat near the fire with my back to the wall. Hours passed like that. Around 11, I thought I heard soft crunching sounds outside, like feet pressing against leaves. My skin prickled. I didn't move, just sat listening, every muscle tense. Then it went quiet again. I must have dozed off near the fire, because the next thing I knew, I was startled awake by a faint knock. Not on the door, on the glass of the small window. It was slow, deliberate. I didn't move at first, my mind trying to convince me I had imagined it. Then it came again, soft, steady taps against the glass. I turned my head slowly toward the window. At first, I couldn't see anything, but as my eyes adjusted, I caught sight of her. A woman, standing just outside the glass. Her hair long and dark, her face pale. Her eyes were locked on me, wide and unblinking. She didn't say anything, didn't move, just stared, her hand resting against the glass. I shot up, heart racing, and backed away from the window. For what felt like forever, she just stood there, watching me. Then, as if she had never been there, she turned and walked back toward the woods, disappearing into the blackness. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up the entire night, gripping the poker from the fireplace like a weapon, waiting for her to return. She didn't. When the sun finally rose, I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my bag, stuffed my things inside, and bolted out the door. I didn't even bother covering the fire. I sprinted to my car, started it, and drove down that dirt path as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't look back. I kept driving until I was well into the city again, surrounded by traffic and noise, the comfort of other people close by. I never went back to that cabin. Later, I looked into its history, trying to make sense of what I had seen. It turned out the place had been abandoned for years. Locals claimed squatters sometimes passed through, but no one matched the description of the woman I saw. The memory of her face pressed against that glass still sits sharp in my mind, and I can't shake the thought that if I had opened the door, or even hesitated longer, something worse might have happened. That trip was supposed to clear my head. Instead, it left me with a memory I'll never be able to forget. A reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't in stories, but standing right outside your window in the dark. I was 34 the year I decided to take a late-season hunting trip out to a small cabin in the northern woods of Minnesota. It was November of 1996, and the days were short, the air sharp, the ground covered with a thin layer of crusted snow. I had rented the cabin from a man I barely knew, a coworker's cousin, who told me it was nothing fancy. Just 4 walls, a roof, a wood stove, and enough room to sleep. That was all I wanted. I wasn't after comfort, just quiet and the chance to hunt deer without being bothered. The cabin sat about 3 miles from the main road, reached by a narrow trail that wound through pine and birch. I parked my old truck at the start of the trail and loaded my pack with gear. My rifle hung from my shoulder, and my boots sank into the icy crust as I walked in. The woods were quiet, too quiet, except for the occasional snap of a branch echoing far away. I remember thinking how still the air felt, like everything was holding its breath. By the time I reached the cabin, dusk had started to creep in. It was smaller than I expected, leaning slightly to one side as if the ground had shifted underneath it years ago. The roof was patched with tin sheets, and the single window had cracks sealed over with old tape. When I opened the door, the smell hit me first. Damp wood, dust, and something faintly sour, like old food. Inside, there was one cot pushed against the wall, a table with a lantern, and a wood stove that looked rusted but usable. I dropped my gear, lit the lantern, and set about starting a fire. The sound of the wood popping in the stove felt comforting, and I let myself relax. I cooked a simple meal of beans and jerky, then laid out my rifle and hunting knife, checking them over by lantern light. When I finally stretched out on the cot, I could hear the wind moving outside, pressing against the walls of the cabin like a slow tide. That first night, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, just enough to drag me out of sleep. A scrape, maybe, or a dull thump. I held still, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, the only light a faint orange glow inside the stove. I told myself it was just the wind pushing a branch against the cabin, or maybe ice shifting on the roof. But the sound came again, a dragging noise across the porch just outside the door. My chest tightened as I stared at the door in the dim light, waiting. After a long few minutes, nothing else happened. I finally told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or stray dog sniffing around, and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I checked outside. There were tracks in the snow, but they weren't clear. They looked human at first glance, but not quite right. Too wide, too soft around the edges, as if someone had pressed down heavy boots and then scuffed them out. I crouched over them for a long while, squinting, trying to make sense of it. I told myself they were just melted deer tracks, distorted from the overnight freeze. Still, unease settled in my stomach as I brushed snow over them and moved on. The day passed without luck. I hiked deep into the woods, sat for hours, and never saw a single deer. The woods felt empty, as though the animals had all vanished. The silence weighed on me, and by the time I trudged back toward the cabin, my legs ached and my nerves were raw. That night, the noises came back, this time louder. Something circling the cabin slowly, crunching over the frozen ground. I lay in the cot, every muscle locked, listening to it move, step by step, then silence, then the faint groan of the porch boards under weight. My rifle rested beside me, and my hand never left it. The fire in the stove had nearly gone out, leaving the room in darkness except for a sliver of moonlight through the cracked window. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I found more marks in the snow. Not quite prints, more like scuffs. Patches of disturbed snow leading from the trees up to the cabin, then back into the woods. I felt exposed standing out there, the trees crowding around me like walls. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something or someone was coming around at night. I thought about leaving, but stubbornness got the better of me. I told myself I wasn't about to let some drunk trespasser or wandering animal chase me off. I stayed, but I kept my rifle close even inside the cabin. I double-checked the latch on the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and stacked wood against the walls to keep myself busy, though the work did little to quiet my nerves. That third night was the worst. I barely closed my eyes before I heard it. Slow steps again, circling. I held my breath, staring at the ceiling, every sound magnified in the dark. Then came the knock. Not loud, just 3 dull taps on the wooden wall, near the window. My skin crawled, and I gripped the rifle so hard my knuckles ached. Another knock followed, this time lower, near the base of the wall, almost like fingers tapping. I sat up, raised the rifle toward the window, waiting for the slightest movement. Minutes passed like hours. Eventually the sound stopped, but I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I'd had enough. I stepped outside, the rifle in my hands, ready to confront whoever was playing games. The snow around the cabin was torn up now, trampled in wide arcs, as though someone had walked circles again and again. The tracks weren't shaped right, almost like boots being dragged sideways. They led back into the woods, deeper and deeper, until they vanished among the trees. I packed that morning, every move hurried and stiff. I didn't care about hunting anymore. My nerves were shot. My head throbbed from lack of sleep, and I couldn't shake the sense that if I stayed another night, something bad would happen. I doused the stove, stuffed my gear back into my pack, and slung the rifle over my shoulder. Walking back down that narrow trail toward my truck, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The woods were silent, but it wasn't the natural quiet of winter anymore. Felt like something was there, following just out of sight. The hairs on my neck stood on end with every step. My boots crunched over the frozen ground, and every sound felt too loud, as though it would give me away. When I finally reached the truck, relief nearly buckled my knees. I tossed my gear into the bed, started the engine, and didn't look back as I drove away. The cabin, the woods, all of it disappeared in the rearview mirror, and I let out a long, shaking breath. I never went back. I told people later that the hunting was poor, that the cabin wasn't worth the trouble, but the truth was simpler. Something was out there, maybe a person, maybe just something I couldn't explain, but it wasn't right. I still don't know who or what circled that cabin at night, or why they didn't try the door, or what those tracks really were. What I do know is that I was alone out there, miles from anyone, and something kept watching, walking, waiting in the dark. That was enough to make sure I never set foot in those woods again. I had been driving most of the day when I finally reached the cabin I had rented. It was September of 2014, a cool stretch of days when summer had finally started letting go of its grip in northern Arizona. I was 32 back then, single, with no kids and no real ties to anyone, so I took trips like this often. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a square wooden place tucked against a cluster of pines with a dirt driveway that looked like nobody had used it in months. The owner I rented it from online said hunters sometimes used it in the fall, but otherwise it stayed empty. When I stepped out of my car, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that presses in on you. No traffic, no human voices, not even distant machinery or airplanes overhead. Just the occasional creak of tree branches rubbing together in the wind. I unloaded my things, one duffel bag with clothes, a box with dry food, and a small cooler, and carried them inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and dust. There were 2 rooms, a small kitchen with a table and a living area with a couch, then a back room with a single bed. The bed had a thin blanket, and the mattress sagged in the middle, but I figured it would do. I spent the first hour sweeping dust and opening the small windows to air the place out. The sun dropped lower as I worked, leaving the light sharp and orange across the trees outside. I wasn't scared yet, just aware of how isolated it felt. The nearest town was 40 minutes away down a 2-lane highway, and there were no other cabins within sight. That was part of the appeal, or at least what I had told myself when I booked it. By dark, I had heated up a can of beans on the gas stove and sat down at the little table. The windows were dark rectangles now, showing nothing but blackness. I remember how I kept glancing at them, like I expected to see something move outside, but of course nothing did. I finished my food, cleaned up, and finally sat down on the couch with my flashlight and a paperback book. Around 10, I heard the first noise. It wasn't much, just something light out by the tree line. At first I thought it was the wind, but it had rhythm to it, like steps pressing down on loose dirt and pine needles. I killed my lantern and sat still, holding my breath, listening. The sound came again, closer, then stopped completely. My heart thumped hard in my chest. I told myself it was a deer, maybe an elk wandering through. That was common out here. I waited 10 minutes before turning the light back on. Nothing else happened. I tried to read again, but my eyes kept jumping back to the dark window. Eventually, I gave up and went to bed, sliding my duffel against the door out of habit. I woke up around 2 in the morning. I didn't know why at first, just the sudden awareness that pulled me out of sleep. Then I heard it again. Not steps this time, but something dragging across the outside wall. Slow, steady. I froze in the dark, staring at the ceiling. It moved from one corner of the cabin to the other, like someone tracing the wood with their hand as they walked. My skin prickled, every hair on my arm standing up. I wanted to tell myself it was a branch scraping in the wind, but there were no branches near the wall. After a while, it stopped. I didn't move, didn't even roll over. I stayed awake like that until dawn crept in through the window, a pale gray light that felt like relief. The next morning, I went outside to check. Sure enough, along the side of the cabin, there were faint marks in the dust on the wood. They weren't claw marks, nothing dramatic, just streaks like fingers or sticks had been dragged along. I stood there a long time staring at them, trying to reason it out. Maybe a raccoon or porcupine had been curious, but the lines were too long and even. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I told myself I'd come all this way for some peace, and I wasn't about to spook myself out after one night. I went for a walk through the pines, carrying a thermos of coffee, trying to shake it off. The forest was beautiful in the daylight. Sunlight cut through the branches, lighting up patches of grass. I saw deer tracks in the soft dirt, and once I even spotted a rabbit darting between bushes. It made me feel better. That evening, though, the unease came back. The cabin felt smaller when the sun went down, like the darkness pressed against it on all sides. I made myself another simple meal, tried to read again, and told myself to stop glancing at the window. But the noises started earlier that night. Just past 9, before I had even gone to bed, I heard it. A low sound, almost like a cough, carried through the trees. It wasn't close, but it was human. I know the difference between an animal call and a person clearing their throat, and this was no coyote. My stomach dropped. I sat frozen at the table, staring at the door. Nobody was supposed to be out here. For the next hour, I heard occasional snaps of branches. Not constant, just enough to remind me someone or something was moving around out there. I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, holding my flashlight like a weapon. My ears strained at every creak of the cabin settling, every rustle of wind. At some point, the footsteps came back. They circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, crunching over gravel and pine needles. I didn't breathe. They paused right outside the bedroom window, so close I imagined someone's face inches from the glass, staring in. The window was too dark for me to see anything, but I could feel them standing there. My throat tightened until I thought I'd choke. After what felt like forever, the steps moved away again. I didn't sleep that night at all. When daylight came, I packed my bag without even making coffee. My hands shook as I shoved clothes into the duffel. Before leaving, I walked once around the cabin. In the soft dirt, I found tracks, bare footprints, not boots or shoes. The toes were long, the prints wide, like someone had walked circles around the cabin in the middle of the night. The hair on the back of my neck rose. Whoever it was had been watching me for hours. I didn't bother locking the cabin when I left. I threw my things in the car, drove down the dirt road faster than I should have, and didn't look back. The entire way to town, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone running after me through the trees. When I finally hit the highway, I pulled over at a gas station and sat there with my head against the steering wheel. I tried to make sense of it. The dragging sound, the cough in the woods, the footprints. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't my imagination. It was someone out there, moving through the trees, watching me. People call things like that skinwalkers around here, giving it a name to make it fit into a story. But it wasn't a story. It was a person, maybe sick, maybe dangerous, stalking me in the woods. That thought stayed with me as I drove home and unpacked days later. Still stays with me now, because the worst part isn't that someone was out there watching me. The worst part is wondering how long they had been doing it and whether they had followed me before I even realized it. I was 32 when I took a long weekend off from work in the autumn of 2014. I had been living in Manchester at the time, drowning in paperwork and constant noise, and I needed a break from the city. A friend of mine had mentioned that deep in the rural parts of Northumberland, past the forests and narrow back roads, there were plenty of old walking trails and quiet places where people rarely went anymore. He mentioned an abandoned cabin, too, in passing, something about how it used to belong to a farmer's family years ago before they moved away. He didn't go into details, but the image of a forgotten place out in the woods stuck in my mind. I didn't tell him, but I decided to try to find it. The drive was long. It took nearly 5 hours, winding through smaller and smaller roads until the last stretch was nothing but dirt and gravel. The air was colder than I expected, sharp and damp. Leaves had already turned a burnt orange and deep brown, and some were plastered to the muddy road from the earlier rain. I parked my car near a gate where the road ended, took my rucksack, and started walking. The sound of my boots crunching wet leaves echoed in the silence. No traffic, no voices, not even the usual birdsong. Just the heavy stillness of the countryside. After an hour or so of walking, I finally came across it. The cabin looked even more abandoned than I had imagined. It sat low in a clearing, crooked and half swallowed by weeds and long grass. The roof sagged to one side, patched with rusted metal sheets. The wooden boards that made up the walls were gray and splintering, eaten away by time and weather. The windows were either cracked or completely missing, with jagged shards of glass still hanging in some of the frames. The front door leaned open slightly, not quite closed, like someone had gone in and never bothered to shut it behind them. I hesitated for a while outside, just staring. It wasn't fear of ghosts or anything like that. I don't believe in that sort of thing, but more the unsettling thought of how long it had stood there untouched. Old buildings carry a heaviness with them. You can almost feel the weight of the years pressing against you when you step inside. I brushed it off and pushed the door slowly. Creaked loud enough to make the silence feel heavier. Inside, the smell hit me first. It was damp, rotten wood mixed with mold. The floorboards were soft in places, and I had to test each step before putting my full weight down. The room was cluttered with broken furniture. A chair was tipped on its side near the wall. A table had one leg missing, and an old metal bed frame without a mattress leaned crookedly in the corner. The fireplace was full of old ashes, long cold. There were scraps of paper on the floor, yellow and brittle, too ruined to read. I could tell no one had cared about this place for decades. I walked further in, exploring each room. The cabin wasn't big, 2 rooms at most, one that had been a main living space and the other likely a bedroom. The bedroom was worse. The ceiling had partially collapsed, letting water and leaves fall in. The floor was wet and spongy, covered with black mold creeping up the walls. In the corner, I noticed an old wardrobe, its doors half open. Inside were bits of clothing, or what was left of them. Fabric that disintegrated when I touched it, eaten away by damp and insects. The longer I stayed, the more I felt uneasy. It wasn't supernatural, but more the sense of intrusion. This place had been forgotten for so long, and here I was walking through it like a trespasser. I decided to sit down for a while, pulled out a bottle of water, and tried to take in the silence. That was when I noticed something small but deeply unsettling. On the floor near the fireplace was a pile of ash, but it wasn't decades old. It was fresher, lighter in color, and above it were small charred bits of wood that hadn't completely turned to ash yet. My chest tightened. Someone had lit a fire here, not recently as in hours, but definitely within the last few months. The thought of someone else using this abandoned cabin without anyone knowing about it made my skin crawl. I kept scanning the room, more aware now, and I saw other details I had missed. A half-empty tin can, tucked behind the broken chair. It looked newer, not rusted like the rest of the junk in the cabin. A sleeping bag, too, pushed under the bed frame, dirty but clearly not from decades ago. Someone had been here, maybe still was. I stood up quickly, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest outside was. My ears strained for any noise. Footsteps, a door, breathing. But all I heard was the blood pounding in my ears. The air felt tighter, heavier. I picked up my rucksack and decided I had seen enough. I tried to walk out calmly, but every step felt louder than it should. The boards creaked under me as I moved toward the front door, and I couldn't shake the thought of someone watching me from the trees outside, waiting for me to step out. I pushed through the door and stepped into the clearing, trying to act normal, but my heart was racing. I scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, but I still felt the prickle on the back of my neck, like I wasn't alone. The walk back to my car was a blur. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me down the trail. At one point, I thought I heard twigs snap somewhere behind me, but when I stopped, the woods went silent again. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking. I threw my bag in the back seat, got inside, and locked the doors immediately. I sat there for a while, staring at the road ahead, catching my breath. When I finally started the engine, the sound was almost too loud in the stillness. I drove fast, the gravel crunching under the tires, not slowing down until I was miles away. I didn't stop until I reached a small petrol station along the main road, where the sight of other people finally calmed me down. The whole drive home, I kept thinking about the cabin. Someone was living there, hiding out where no one would look for them. It wasn't a place you'd stumble across by accident. It was too deep in the woods. Whoever used it chose it because they wanted to stay unseen. I still don't know who it was, and I don't want to, but the thought that I sat there, inside their shelter, drinking water as if it was just an old ruin, makes my stomach turn even now. I never went back. Every time I think about it, I picture the sleeping bag under the bed frame, the tin can, and the ashes in the fireplace. It wasn't a ghost story. It was worse because it was real. Someone had been there, and I had walked right into their home without knowing it. If they had returned while I was still inside, I don't know what would have happened. That was enough to keep me from ever chasing abandoned places again. I was 36 when I agreed to look after my uncle's farm for a week while he and his wife went to visit relatives down south. It was the summer of 1998, hot during the day but strangely cold at night, the kind of weather that makes the air feel heavy and strange when the sun goes down. His place sat on the edge of a small town in northern Iowa, but the farm itself was isolated, with the nearest neighbor a good mile away. It wasn't a big modern operation, just a few acres of corn, a couple of barns, a small herd of cattle, and a cabin he had built years ago at the far end of the property near a patch of woods. He usually stayed in the main farmhouse, but he told me I could use the cabin if I wanted peace and quiet. I thought it would be relaxing. I brought a few books, some food, and planned to enjoy the solitude. The cabin was rough but comfortable, with old pine floors, a single bedroom, and a wood stove in case the nights got cold. The first day was calm, nothing out of the ordinary. I fed the cattle, checked the fences, walked the property, and settled into the cabin at dusk. The air was thick with the smell of cut grass and the distant hum of crickets. It was later, when darkness really settled, that I started noticing things that didn't sit right. The woods behind the cabin always felt strange, too quiet at times, then bursting with noise as if something large was moving through them. I told myself it was deer or raccoons, nothing unusual for the area, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. The old wooden walls of the cabin creaked with every change in temperature, but some of the noises didn't sound like wood. Some sounded heavier, like weight shifting against the outer wall. The second night, I was outside just before bed, standing near the edge of the field smoking a cigarette. The field stretched wide, the corn still short that time of year, no taller than my waist. As I stood there, I noticed movement out by the fence line. At first it looked like a man walking along the edge, but the distance made it hard to tell. Whoever it was seemed to stop when I looked directly at them. I froze. The figure didn't move again. I waited a good minute, then turned back toward the cabin. When I glanced back, the figure was gone. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe my eyes playing games. Still, I locked the cabin door that night. The third day was busy with farm chores. I kept my mind occupied, but when the sun dipped low again, that uneasy feeling returned. The cattle were restless. They paced near the fence, bellowing louder than usual. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of the cows making noise like they were panicked. I grabbed a flashlight and went out. The beam cut across the yard, and I could see the herd gathered at one corner of the pasture, pressed tight together like they were trying to get away from something. My stomach knotted. I scanned the fence line but saw nothing. No coyotes, no dogs, nothing that should have spooked them. I stayed out there for a while, the beam of my flashlight sweeping back and forth. Finally, the cows settled a bit, so I went back inside, though I barely slept. The fourth night was worse. I had just gotten into bed when I heard footsteps on the gravel outside the cabin. Not the quick scurry of an animal, but slow, heavy steps, like boots on rock. My mouth went dry. The sound stopped right outside the cabin wall. I lay there frozen, staring at the ceiling, listening. After a long pause, the steps moved around toward the back. I didn't dare look out the window. I just lay there, every muscle tense, gripping the handle of the hunting knife I had brought with me. The steps faded after a while, but I didn't sleep at all that night. By the fifth day, I was exhausted. I thought about leaving early, but pride and stubbornness kept me there. That evening, I went into the woods behind the cabin to look around, hoping to prove to myself it was all in my head. The woods were thick, the ground soft with fallen leaves and mud. After walking 100 yards or so, I found footprints. They weren't boots like I expected, but bare feet. Large, adult-sized footprints pressed deep into the mud, leading further into the trees. My throat tightened as I knelt to look closer. They were fresh. I turned back quickly, walking fast until I saw the cabin again. That night, I didn't even try to sleep in the bed. I stayed up with the lights on, sitting in a chair by the front door, shotgun across my lap. Hours crawled by in silence until just after 2 in the morning when I heard the sound again. Footsteps, moving slow, circling the cabin. My skin prickled. I held my breath, listening. Then came the sound of something scraping against the wood, like fingernails dragging across the wall. I gripped the shotgun tighter. The scraping stopped, then silence. I sat there until dawn, stiff and shaking. The 6th day, I decided I was done. I did the morning chores quickly and started packing my things. Before leaving, I went to check on the cattle one last time. That's when I noticed the far fence had been cut. The wire was snipped clean, like with bolt cutters. One of the cows was missing. My chest felt hollow as I stared at the gap in the fence. Someone had been out there, and it wasn't kids messing around. This was deliberate. I didn't wait around after that. I drove straight back to town and called my uncle from a payphone, telling him what happened. He didn't sound surprised, just told me he would handle it when he got back. I never asked him what he meant by that. I never went back to that cabin either. Even now, years later, I still think about those nights. The sound of footsteps on gravel, the sight of fresh footprints in the woods, the cattle pressed together like they were hiding. I know what I experienced was real. There was someone out there watching me from the dark. They knew I was alone, and they wanted me to know they were there. The worst part isn't the fear I felt at the time. It's the thought of what might have happened if I had stayed one more night. I was 34 years old in the autumn of 1997 when I decided to spend a few days away from the city. Life in Birmingham had started to wear me down. The noise, the endless movement, the stress of work. I wanted silence, something away from the constant hum of traffic. A friend of mine told me about a small place in Staffordshire where there were scattered old cabins near abandoned farmland, the sort of places no one really cared about anymore. Some of them were barely standing. Others had been patched up here and there by farmers who still came through during planting season. One of them sat not far from an old graveyard that dated back to the early 1800s. The idea of being close to a graveyard didn't bother me at first. I wasn't superstitious, and I had no interest in ghost stories or the sort of things people whispered about in pubs. For me, it was just about peace and quiet. A few nights in an old cabin, no interruptions, just the sound of wind in the trees. That was all I wanted. I drove there on a Friday evening. my car rattling over narrow country lanes that seemed to get smaller the further I went. The sun was low, painting the fields gold, and I remember the sharp chill that came as soon as it dipped. By the time I parked near the cabin, the light was fading fast. The cabin itself was rough. Its wooden planks were dark and weathered, the roof sagged slightly, and the front door looked like it had been forced open more than once in the past. The ground around it was uneven, patches of weeds and wild grass reaching high. Just beyond the tree line, about 200 yards away, I could see the tilted stones of the graveyard, some of them leaning so far over they looked like they might collapse at any moment. The fence that once surrounded it had long since rotted away. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and dust. The floor creaked under my boots, and cobwebs stretched across the corners. There was a small stove against the wall, rust eating away at its edges, and a single table with one wobbly chair. A mattress lay in the corner, old but still intact, covered in a thin sheet. I had brought my own sleeping bag, so I wasn't too worried about that. That first night, I sat on the step outside with a torch beside me and ate some food I'd packed. The quiet was deep, heavier than anything I'd felt in the city. The only sounds were the wind shifting through the branches and the occasional distant call of some night bird. I noticed how the graveyard stood out in the moonlight, the stones white and sharp against the dark. I stared at it longer than I meant to. There was something about the way the stones seemed to be leaning toward the cabin, like a crowd pressing closer. I went inside, locked the door with the old latch, and lay down. Sleep didn't come easy. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. Every little creak in the walls, every movement outside, felt amplified. Around midnight, I heard something that wasn't just the house settling. It was a shuffle, slow and deliberate, in the grass outside. I held my breath and listened harder. Then it stopped. In the morning, I tried to laugh it off. Probably a fox or badger nosing around. I stepped outside, the cold air waking me fully. I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks. The grass was bent in places near the back wall, like something had moved along there during the night. Not just once, but several times, as if circling. My stomach tightened a little, but I forced myself to brush it off. It was countryside, after all. Animals moved freely. I decided to take a walk to the graveyard. The stones were even more weathered up close, names and dates almost rubbed smooth. Some went as far back as 1813. The earth was uneven, many graves sunken in slightly, the wood from old coffins long rotted away. I stood there for a while, reading what I could. A lot of children, I noticed. Life hadn't been easy back then. I didn't like how quiet it felt, though. Not peaceful, not restful. Just heavy, like the ground itself was pressing against me. I turned back to the cabin sooner than I'd planned. The second night was worse. Rain started in the evening, hard against the roof, water dripping through tiny gaps in the wood. I sat with a lantern on the table, listening to the storm. The light flickered and shadows stretched across the walls. Around 11, the rain slowed, and that was when I heard the noise again. Not an animal this time. It was footsteps in the grass, slow, steady. They came from the direction of the graveyard. I froze, every muscle in my body tight. The steps stopped just outside the cabin. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then came a soft scrape, like something brushing against the wooden wall. I sat there until my chest hurt from holding my breath. Eventually, the sound faded. I didn't sleep at all that night. When morning came, I checked outside again. Mud near the cabin showed impressions. Not paws, boots. Someone had been walking around in the rain, circling just like before. I felt sick. The graveyard was empty when I looked, but that didn't make me feel any better. I thought about leaving that day, packing up and driving back to the city. But I told myself it was just some local messing with me. Kids sometimes did that sort of thing, sneaking around cabins, trying to scare off visitors. I forced myself to stay. The third night was the worst. I barely ate. I kept the lantern burning low and sat against the wall with my back to it, facing the door. The night was colder, my breath visible even inside. The silence pressed in on me again, thicker than before. Around midnight, it came back. Footsteps, slow, careful, circling again. Then they stopped directly outside the door. The latch rattled. Someone was trying it gently, as if testing how strong it was. I felt my chest tighten so hard it hurt. I picked up the rusted poker from the stove and held it tight, my hands sweating. The latch held. After a long while, the sound moved away, fading toward the graveyard. At dawn, I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed my bag, stuffed everything back inside, and left. I didn't even look back at the cabin. My car felt like safety, like the only barrier left between me and whatever had been circling me those nights. I drove out fast, not stopping until I hit the main road. Only then did I breathe properly again. I never went back. To this day, I don't know who or what it was. A drifter maybe, someone living rough near the graveyard, watching from the trees. Or maybe it was someone who didn't want strangers near that cabin, keeping people away the only way they knew how. All I know is the sound of those footsteps hasn't left my head. And I know one thing with absolute certainty. I'll never spend another night near an old graveyard again. I was 32 years old when I decided to take a trip out to a remote cabin in northern Michigan. It was the fall of 2014, late October, just before the first snow usually came in heavy. I had been working too many hours in Detroit and wanted a break from the noise and people. A friend of mine had mentioned an old rental cabin tucked near a stretch of woods, about 5 miles from the nearest paved road. It sounded quiet, maybe too quiet, but that was what I wanted at the time. The drive up there had already set the mood. Once I left the highway, the road narrowed to cracked pavement, then turned to gravel. The last few miles were just dirt, with branches brushing against the sides of my truck. There were no houses, no gas stations, not even a mailbox after a certain point. The only sign that anyone had ever lived out there was a rusted metal gate half open, with a crooked wooden sign nailed to a post that simply said cabin. The cabin itself looked older than I expected. It sat at the edge of a clearing, with tall trees crowding around it like they wanted to take the land back. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the front steps leaned, but the lock worked and the key had been left in a small metal box by the door just as promised. Inside, it smelled like wood smoke and damp leaves. There was a fireplace, 2 small rooms, and a tiny kitchen with a gas stove that looked at least 30 years old. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, powered by a generator in a shed out back. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some canned chili, had a beer, and listened to the wind pushing through the trees. The sound was constant, like a low ocean roar, and every so often a sharp crack of a branch breaking would cut through the air. I wasn't used to that kind of quiet mixed with sudden sharp noises. In the city, there's always a layer of sound that smooths things out. Cars, voices, sirens. Out here, it was either silence or something snapping, and both felt equally unsettling. The second day, I went for a walk deeper into the woods. The ground was covered with damp leaves that stuck to my boots. After about an hour, I realized I hadn't seen a single trail marker or any sign of other people. No beer cans, no old fire pits, no footprints. The forest felt like it didn't want to be touched. I turned back before the sun dropped too low. That night, I made a small fire in the fireplace, sat in the old wooden chair, and tried to read a paperback I'd brought along. But I kept catching myself listening more than reading. It was close to midnight when I first felt uneasy. I had blown out the lantern and was lying in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling. The sound of the wind had changed. It wasn't steady anymore, came in bursts, then stopped. I thought I heard something softer under it, like steps in the leaves outside. At first, I dismissed it as a deer, but the sound came closer, then paused, then started again. Slow, deliberate, like someone trying not to be heard. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, straining my ears. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped near the front door. I waited, heart hammering. After a long silence, there was the faintest tap on the door. Not a knock, not loud, just a single, light touch. My mouth went dry instantly. I didn't move. Whoever it was didn't try again. Minutes passed, and the only sound was the wind picking up again. I didn't sleep that night. At every creak of the cabin walls, I flinched, staring at the door, waiting for the knob to turn. But nothing happened. By morning, when pale light filtered through the grimy window, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it was a branch blowing against the wood. Maybe I was just jumpy. The next day, I busied myself with small things. Chopping wood from the pile, walking down to the small stream nearby, boiling water for coffee. I didn't want to think about the night before, but when evening came, the dread started again. I locked the door, checked the windows twice, and kept the lantern burning longer than usual. I finally blew it out after midnight, telling myself to stop acting paranoid. Not even an hour later, I heard it again. The steps. They were slower this time, scraping against the damp leaves. This time they came to the back of the cabin, near the tiny kitchen window. I lay stiff under the blanket, listening. The window had no curtain, just dirty glass, and I couldn't see it from where I lay. The thought of someone standing there in the dark, watching, made my skin crawl. Then came another sound, the shed door creaking open. The generator was in there. My stomach dropped. If they cut that, I'd be in total darkness. I didn't move from the bed, afraid to even get up and check. The shed door creaked again, then shut. Footsteps receded. After that, nothing but silence for hours. By the time the sky lightened, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my bag quickly, shoving clothes and food into it without care. But when I went outside, I froze. In the soft dirt just beyond the steps, there were footprints. Clear ones. Too small to be mine, too narrow to be Boots. They circled the cabin exactly the way I had heard them. My chest tightened. I loaded my things into the truck fast, hands shaking. The whole drive back down the dirt road, I kept looking into the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there watching me leave. I didn't breathe easy until I hit pavement. Later that week, back at home, I told myself it was probably some drifter, maybe a hunter who had too much to drink and got curious about the cabin. But the footprints bothered me. They weren't the kind made by heavy boots or work shoes. They looked more like worn-out sneakers, thin tread, not deep. And the way they circled the cabin without coming inside, that wasn't random. That was deliberate. Someone wanted me to know they had been there, close enough to touch the door, close enough to cut the power, but choosing not to. I never went back to that cabin. I never even asked my friend about it. All I know is I've stayed away from rentals in the woods since then. Whenever I hear the sound of leaves scraping under shoes in the fall, it still brings me right back to that night. The steps circling, the tap at the door, and the thought that whoever it was could have come in any time, but chose to wait outside instead.